Margaret Henley's trembling hand clutched her last dollar as she stood before the auction block in 1867 Nevada territory, watching a hooded Navajo man whose quiet dignity somehow called to her own desperate loneliness. When her impulsive bid of $1 won her more than just help for her failing farm, she discovered that the true price of the heart couldn't be measured in coins. But what happens when the man she bought for $1 reveals a secret that could change both their lives forever? Blood dripped from Margaret Henley's torn fingernails as she clawed through the dirt behind her cabin, searching for the mason jar buried beneath the old oak tree. The Nevada Territory sun beat down mercilessly on this October morning in 1867. But desperation kept her digging even as sweat stung her eyes. "Please be there," she whispered to the empty air, her voice cracking like dried leather. 6 months ago, she had buried this jar containing her last hope coins saved from selling Edwin's tools, hidden from the creditors who circled her small farm like hungry wolves. Her shovel struck glass with a sound that made her heart leap. Inside the jar, $3 silver and 47 cents in copper pennies caught the morning light. Not enough to save the farm, but enough for something. She wasn't sure what yet. The sound of horses approaching made her freeze. Through the gaps in her wooden fence, she spotted Harold Buckley riding up her dusty path, his black stallion kicking up clouds that settled on everything like a curse. Behind him rode 2 men she didn't recognize, their faces hard as the rocks that jutted from the Nevada hills. Margaret quickly buried the jar again and brushed dirt from her dark dress. Buckley had been sniffing around her property since Edwin died of cholera, making offers that sounded generous but felt like threats. His ranch stretched across most of the valley, and her small farm sat right in the middle of his expansion plans. "Morning, Margaret," Buckley called out, tipping his hat with fake politeness. His smile reminded her of a snake she'd once seen swallow a mouse whole. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're managing." "Managing just fine, Harold." Margaret kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "No need for concern." Buckley dismounted and walked closer, his boots crunching on the dry grass. "Now, that's not what I'm hearing in town. Word is, you're behind on payments to the bank. Word is, you might lose this place before winter sets in." Margaret's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The banker, Mr. Peterson, had promised to keep her business private. Apparently, promises meant less than gossip in Silver Creek. "My business is my own," she said, lifting her chin the way her mother had taught her when facing down bullies. "Course it is," Buckley agreed, but his eyes were already measuring her property like a man planning to divide up a pie. "Just thought you should know I'm still willing to pay fair price for your land. $500 cash money, enough to start fresh somewhere else. Maybe back east, where a woman alone might have better prospects." $500. The amount hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. It was more money than Margaret had ever seen at one time, more than Edwin had made in 3 good years combined. But it was also surrender, giving up the only home she'd ever known to a man who thought her loneliness made her weak. "I'm not selling," Margaret said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Buckley's smile tightened. "Think on it. Winter's coming, and this territory doesn't forgive folks who aren't prepared." He remounted his horse with practiced ease. "Offer stands through the end of the month." After that, he shrugged, leaving the threat unfinished. After they rode away, Margaret stood in her yard, feeling like a sparrow facing down a hawk. She looked at her small cabin with its sagging porch, at the garden where stubborn weeds grew taller than corn, at the barn that leaked when it rained. Everything needed work she couldn't afford, repairs that required money she didn't have. But this was her place. Edwin had built it with his own hands, board by board, nail by nail. They had planned to fill it with children who never came, had dreamed of growing old together, watching sunsets from the front porch. Those dreams lay in the cemetery now, alongside Edwin's bones, but the land remained. Margaret walked to the well and drew up a bucket of cool water, splashing it on her face to wash away the dust and fear. As she did, she heard something unexpected: laughter and music drifting from the direction of town. It was auction day, she remembered suddenly. The 3rd Saturday of every month. Folks gathered in the town square to buy and sell everything from livestock to household goods. An idea began forming in her mind, wild and desperate as a Mustang breaking free from a rope. She had $3.47, not enough to save her farm, but maybe enough to buy help. Maybe enough to buy time. Margaret changed into her best dress, the blue one with tiny flowers that Edwin had liked. She pinned her brown hair back in a neat bun and looked at herself in the cracked mirror above her wash basin. At 32, she looked older than her years, worn down by grief and worry, but her green eyes still held fire, and her jaw still knew how to set with determination. She hitched up her horse, Buttercup, to the small wagon Edwin had built for trips to town. The mare was getting old, her brown coat now more gray than anything else, but she still had spirit. Like me, Margaret thought as they rolled down the dusty road toward Silver Creek. The town buzzed with activity when she arrived. Ranchers, farmers, shopkeepers, and drifters crowded around the auction platform in the center of the square. The smell of dust, sweat, and livestock filled the air, mixed with the sweet scent of apple pies cooling on Mrs. Patterson's windowsill. Margaret tied Buttercup to a hitching post and made her way through the crowd. The auctioneer, a thin man named Collins with a voice like a rusty gate, was selling off furniture from the Peterson house. Apparently, the banker's own wife had decided to redecorate, which struck Margaret as ironic given how tight he claimed money was for everyone else. "Next lot," Collins announced, his voice cutting through the chatter. "One Navajo. Strong back. Quiet nature. Good for farm work or mining. Bidding starts at $5. Margaret's attention snapped to the platform like iron drawn to a magnet. A man stood there, bound with rope and wearing a burlap sack over his head. Even with his face hidden, she could see the strength in his shoulders, the proud way he held himself despite the humiliation of his situation. Something about his stillness reminded her of a wild horse that had been caught but not broken. $5, called out Jim Morrison, who owned the largest cattle ranch after Buckley's. $6, shouted another voice. Margaret found herself pushing closer to the platform, drawn by something she couldn't name. The man's hands were tied in front of him, but she could see they were calloused from honest work, scarred in the way that spoke of survival rather than violence. $7. The bidding continued, but Margaret barely heard it. She was thinking about Buckley's threat, about winter coming, about the work that needed doing on her farm. She was thinking about loneliness and desperation, and the strange ways that fate sometimes offered solutions when you least expected them. Going once for $7. Margaret's hand moved toward her purse without conscious thought. Inside, her fingers found the coins she had dug up that morning. $3.47. Not nearly enough to win the bidding, but enough for something else entirely. Going twice. The words escaped her lips before her mind could catch them, hanging in the air like smoke from a spent match. $1. Silence fell over the auction yard like a heavy blanket, broken only by the sound of wind whistling through the gaps between buildings. Every face in the crowd turned toward Margaret, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized what she had done. Did she say $1? Someone whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Laughter began rippling through the crowd, starting soft but growing louder with each passing second. Men slapped their knees and women covered their mouths with gloved hands, but their eyes sparkled with cruel amusement. The widows lost her mind. "Mrs. Henderson declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had appointed herself judge of everyone else's business. Poor dear probably doesn't even know what she's bidding on." Margaret's face burned with embarrassment, but she kept her chin high. She had made her bid, foolish as it might seem to others, and she would stand by it. There was something about the man on the platform that called to her, something in the way he held himself that reminded her of her own determination to keep standing despite everything trying to knock her down. The auctioneer, Collins, scratched his head beneath his worn hat. In 30 years of running auctions, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. The current bid was $7, and here was a widow offering one. It went against every rule of sensible commerce. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the current bid is $7. You'd need to bid 8 or higher to stay in the running." "I bid $1, Margaret repeated, her voice stronger this time. She wasn't sure why she was doing this, only that something deep inside her insisted it was right. $1 for the man. More laughter erupted from the crowd, but not all of it was cruel. Some folks seemed genuinely puzzled by her behavior, while others looked almost impressed by her boldness. In a territory where most people played it safe, Margaret Henley was doing something completely unexpected. "Now hold on," Jim Morrison protested. His weathered face creased with annoyance. That's not how auctions work. She can't just ignore the current bid and offer less. Collins wiped sweat from his forehead with a red handkerchief. He had been hoping for a simple day of selling furniture and livestock, not dealing with whatever this situation was turning into. But as he looked at Margaret's determined face, something in her expression reminded him of his own daughter, who had died of fever 3 winters back. There was a desperation there, but also a kind of courage that deserved respect. Actually, Collins said slowly, there's nothing in the territorial law that says a seller has to accept the highest bid. The owner can choose to sell to whoever they want, for whatever price they want. He turned to look at the man who had brought the Navajo to auction, a grizzled prospector named Pete Watkins, who had captured him during a raid on an illegal mining camp. Watkins spat tobacco juice into the dust and shrugged. Don't make no difference to me. $1's a dollar, and I wasn't planning on keeping him fed through winter anyway. Too much trouble. The crowd buzzed with confused murmurs, but Collins raised his hand for quiet. Mrs. Henley, you understand what you're bidding on? This man is being sold for labor. He's not a hired hand who can quit when he wants. He's property, legal and binding. Margaret's stomach twisted at the word property, but she nodded. She understood the law, even if she didn't like it. In 1867, the practice of selling captured Indians was still legal in many parts of the territory, a fact that made her feel sick but didn't change her current situation. I understand, she said quietly. Then sold. Collins brought his gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the square. 1 Navajo man to Mrs. Margaret Henley for $1. The crowd began to disperse, some folks shaking their heads in bewilderment, while others whispered among themselves about the strange transaction they had just witnessed. Margaret made her way to the platform on unsteady legs, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Up close, the man seemed even taller and broader than he had from the crowd. The burlap sack over his head moved slightly with each breath, and she could see his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of someone trying to stay calm in an impossible situation. I'm Margaret, she said softly, her voice barely audible above the wind. I've never done anything like this before. She reached up with trembling fingers to untie the rope that held the sack in place. As the burlap fell away, she found herself looking into the darkest eyes she had ever seen. They were brown, like rich earth after rain, but filled with a wariness so deep it seemed carved into his very bones. His face was angular and weathered, marked by sun and wind and hardship. A scar ran along his left jawline, and his black hair hung past his shoulders, tangled from days of captivity. But despite everything he had been through, there was a dignity in his features that no amount of humiliation could erase. Joseph, he said simply, his voice carrying an accent that spoke of red rocks and endless skies. Why? Margaret stared at him, realizing she had no answer that wouldn't sound like pity or foolishness. How could she explain that she had acted on pure instinct, driven by a recognition of something familiar in his stillness? How could she tell him that his situation had reminded her of her own, trapped, powerless, being sold off to the highest bidder by forces beyond his control? Instead, she focused on untying the ropes that bound his wrists, her fingers working carefully to avoid pulling too tight. His hands were large and calloused, with long fingers that spoke of skill and patience. When the ropes fell away, he rubbed his wrists, where the hemp had chafed his skin raw. I need help with my farm, Margaret said, the lie coming easier than the truth. She couldn't tell him that she had bought him because something in his proud suffering had called to something in her own heart. That would sound like the romantic nonsense Edwin used to tease her about when she read too many novels. Joseph studied her face for a long moment, his dark eyes searching for something she wasn't sure she wanted him to find. Finally, he nodded once, a sharp movement that somehow conveyed both acceptance and resignation. What kind of work? He asked. Margaret felt a flutter of panic as she realized she hadn't thought that far ahead. Her farm was small, mostly garden plots and a few chickens. The barn needed repairs and the fence was falling down in places, but those were jobs that required skills she wasn't sure he possessed. General farm work, she said vaguely. Fixing things. Preparing for winter. Joseph glanced around the square, taking in the faces of people who were still watching them with curiosity and suspicion. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Margaret realized he was calculating his chances of survival in a hostile territory. "I can work," he said finally, "but I am not your slave. I will work for food and shelter, nothing more." The quiet strength in his voice surprised Margaret. Despite being sold like livestock, despite having no legal rights or protections, he was setting boundaries. He was claiming whatever dignity the situation allowed him to keep. "Of course," Margaret agreed quickly. "I just need help. Not anything else." They walked together toward her wagon, an awkward pair drawing stares and whispers from everyone they passed. Margaret kept her eyes forward, but she could feel the judgment radiating from her neighbors like heat from a stove. In their minds, she had either made the bargain of the century or lost her sanity completely. As they reached Buttercup, Joseph ran his hand along the mare's neck with surprising gentleness. The horse, who was usually skittish around strangers, stood perfectly still under his touch. "Good horse," he said quietly. "Strong spirit, even in old age." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest at his kindness toward her mare. A man who treated animals with respect couldn't be all bad, no matter what circumstances had brought him to the auction block. They climbed onto the wagon bench, sitting carefully apart with space between them that felt both necessary and awkward. As Margaret picked up the reins, she caught sight of Harold Buckley watching them from across the square. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes made her stomach clench with worry. The ride back to her farm passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and Buttercup's steady hoofbeats. Margaret kept stealing glances at Joseph from the corner of her eye, wondering what thoughts were running through his mind. Was he planning to run away at the first opportunity? Was he angry about being sold like property? Was he dangerous? But when she looked at his hands resting calmly on his knees, at the patient way he endured the stares of people they passed on the road, she felt her fears begin to ease. Whatever else Joseph might be, he didn't seem like a man prone to violence or cruelty. As they turned up the dusty path to her cabin, Margaret realized she had crossed a line she could never uncross. She had bought a human being for $1, and now she had to figure out what that meant for both of their futures. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Margaret of the fire that burned in her own heart, small but stubborn, refusing to be extinguished despite everything trying to snuff it out. The sound of an axe splitting wood echoed across Margaret's farm at dawn, each strike sharp and purposeful like a heartbeat refusing to quit. She opened her eyes in the darkness of her bedroom, confused for a moment about who could be working so early, then remembered the man sleeping in her barn. Joseph had been on her property for exactly 1 week, and already everything felt different. Not just the steady rhythm of productive work, but something deeper, the sense that her small farm was no longer holding its breath, waiting to die. Margaret dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness and stepped onto her porch, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders against the October chill. Through the morning mist, she could see Joseph's silhouette beside the woodpile, his movements efficient and controlled as he split logs into perfect pieces for her stove. In 7 days, he had repaired the fence that had been falling down for months, cleared the weeds from her vegetable garden, and somehow coaxed her 3 stubborn chickens into laying eggs again. He worked from sunrise to sunset without complaint, speaking only when necessary, maintaining a polite distance that felt both respectful and lonely. Margaret had tried to engage him in conversation during their quiet suppers, but his responses were brief and careful. She learned that he knew about farming, about animals, about fixing things that were broken. But whenever she asked about his past, about his family, about how he had ended up at the auction, his dark eyes would close off like shutters slamming shut. This morning felt different somehow. As Margaret walked toward the woodpile, she noticed something that made her steps slow. Joseph had carved something into one of the larger logs, not words, but symbols that looked like birds in flight, mountains, and running water. The carving was beautiful, detailed work that must have taken hours to complete. "You're an artist," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Joseph's axe paused mid-swing. He turned to look at her, and for the first time since she had brought him home, she saw something other than wariness in his expression, something that might have been embarrassment or perhaps pride. "Just passing time," he said, setting the axe aside. "My hands need to stay busy." Margaret knelt beside the carved log, running her fingers over the intricate symbols. The work was so detailed she could almost feel the wind beneath the bird's wings, almost hear the water flowing over stones. "What do these mean?" she asked. Joseph was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Home," he said simply. "The place where I was born. Where my people lived before." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "Before what?" "Before the soldiers came. Before they decided our land was worth more than our lives." Joseph picked up another log and positioned it on the chopping block, but didn't raise the axe. "My wife died in the fighting. My son." His voice broke slightly. "They took him to a mission school. Said they would make him civilized." Margaret felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. She had known that terrible things happened to Indian families. Everyone in the territory knew, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it made the knowledge sharp and immediate. "How old was your son?" she asked gently. 7 when they took him. Brown hair from his mother, my eyes. Joseph's hands gripped the axe handle so tightly his knuckles went white. "They called him Little Wolf. Now they probably call him something else. Some white man's name that means nothing." Margaret sat down on a nearby stump, her legs suddenly unsteady. She had bought Joseph for $1, thinking she was solving her own problems, but his problems were so much bigger, so much more painful than anything she had faced. "Do you know where he is?" Joseph shook his head. "Could be anywhere. The missions move children around, make it harder for families to find them. They say it's for the children's own good, but..." He raised the axe and brought it down with more force than necessary, splitting the log cleanly in two. They worked together in comfortable silence after that, Joseph splitting wood, while Margaret stacked the pieces in neat rows. The physical work felt good, productive in a way that made her remember why she loved this land despite all its hardships. As the sun climbed higher, Margaret noticed a dust cloud approaching from the direction of town. 3 riders were coming up her path, moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than a friendly visit. "Company coming," Joseph said quietly, his body language shifting into something alert and ready. Margaret shaded her eyes with her hand and recognized the lead rider with a sinking feeling in her stomach. Harold Buckley, riding his black stallion like a man who owned the world. Behind him rode Sheriff Coleman and a third man she didn't recognize, someone with the hard look of a professional fighter. "Get inside," Margaret told Joseph, but he shook his head. "Running makes things worse," he said. "I stay." The riders pulled up in front of Margaret's cabin, their horses stamping and snorting from the hard ride. Buckley dismounted with theatrical flair, his silver spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. "Morning, Margaret," he called out, his voice carrying false cheer that made her skin crawl. "Sheriff Coleman here wanted to have a word with you about your new employee." Sheriff Coleman was a thin, nervous man who had been elected more for his willingness to do what powerful people wanted than for any skill at keeping the peace. He climbed down from his horse awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with whatever errand had brought him here. "Mrs. Henley," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I need to ask you some questions about this Indian you bought at auction." "What kind of questions?" Margaret kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. The third man, who hadn't been introduced, stepped forward. He was big and mean-looking, with scars on his hands that spoke of a life spent hurting people for money. "There's been reports," the sheriff continued, glancing nervously at Buckley, "reports that you might be harboring a dangerous fugitive." Margaret felt anger flare in her chest like a match struck in darkness. "Joseph has been working on my farm. He hasn't done anything wrong." "Joseph, is it?" Buckley's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "And how do you know that's his real name? How do you know he's not lying about who he is, what he's done?" The unnamed man spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly and unpleasant. "I heard there was a Navajo who escaped from a work gang up north, killed 2 guards, stole a horse. Could be this one." Margaret looked at Joseph, who stood perfectly still beside the woodpile. His face revealed nothing, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands hung loose and ready at his sides. "That's ridiculous," she said firmly. "Joseph has been here for a week. He's done nothing but honest work." "See, that's the problem with your kind of thinking, Margaret," Buckley said, his false friendliness finally dropping away. "You want to see the best in people, even when they don't deserve it, even when it puts you in danger." Sheriff Coleman pulled a piece of paper from his vest pocket. I got a warrant here to search your property for stolen goods and to question your hired man about his whereabouts during the past month. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out of this trap. She had no doubt that Buckley was behind this sudden investigation, probably paying the sheriff to harass her until she gave up and sold her land. What stolen goods? She demanded. Horse, the unnamed man said. Saddle, maybe some weapons. He looked directly at Joseph. Things a man might take when he's running from the law. Joseph finally spoke, his voice calm and clear. I have stolen nothing. I have killed no one. I came to the auction because I was captured and sold, same as livestock. That what you say? The man sneered. But we only got your word for it. And my word, Margaret said, stepping closer to Joseph. I know this man. He's been working for me, eating at my table, sleeping in my barn. If he was dangerous, don't you think I'd know it? Buckley laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Margaret, honey, you wouldn't know danger if it bit you on the nose. You're a widow woman living alone, soft-hearted and soft-headed. Not your fault, just how God made you. The condescension in his voice made Margaret's temper flare white-hot. She had spent months listening to people tell her what she could and couldn't handle, what she did and didn't understand. She was tired of being treated like a child who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. Get off my property, she said, her voice shaking with anger. All of you. Right now. Sheriff Coleman looked uncomfortable. Now, Mrs. Henley, I got a legal warrant here. I can't just... Then show me the warrant, Margaret demanded, holding out her hand. Let me read exactly what it says. Coleman hesitated, glancing at Buckley, who nodded slightly. The paper he handed her was official-looking, with a territorial seal at the top, but as Margaret read it, she realized something important. This warrant is for searching the Morrison Ranch, she said slowly. Jim Morrison's place, not mine. Someone made a mistake. The sheriff's face went red as he snatched the paper back and studied it more carefully. Well, I'll be, he muttered. Buckley's expression darkened. Doesn't matter. I still say there's something suspicious about this whole arrangement. Widow woman buying an Indian for $1? Doesn't make sense. Makes perfect sense to me, Margaret replied. I needed help. He needed work. Simple business transaction. Nothing simple about it, the unnamed man said. Indian living this close to town, working a farm, getting ideas above his station. That's how trouble starts. Joseph stepped forward slightly, and Margaret could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a stove. I work for Mrs. Henley, he said quietly. I cause no trouble for anyone. Yet, the man said meaningfully, Margaret realized that this confrontation was about more than just harassment. These men were trying to create a justification for violence, building a case that Joseph was dangerous so they could do something terrible to him with the community's blessing. I think you gentlemen should leave now, she said, putting as much authority into her voice as she could manage. Before this situation gets out of hand, Buckley remounted his horse, but his eyes never left Margaret's face. This isn't over, he said quietly. You're making a mistake, Margaret. A big one. And when it comes back to bite you, don't expect any help from your neighbors. As the three men rode away, Margaret felt her legs go weak with relief and delayed fear. She had just faced down 3 armed men, something the Margaret of 2 months ago would never have believed possible. They'll be back, Joseph said quietly, watching the dust cloud disappear down the path. I know. Margaret looked at him. This man she had bought for $1, who is bringing more trouble into her life than she had ever bargained for. Are you really who you say you are? Joseph met her eyes directly. I am Joseph Standing Bear, of the Dine people. I have never killed anyone except in war. When soldiers attacked my village, I have never stolen anything except food when my family was starving. He paused. But I would do both, if it meant finding my son. The honesty in his voice, the pain and determination mixed together, made Margaret's heart ache. She thought about her own loneliness, her own losses, and realized that some kinds of suffering could only be understood by those who had lived through them. Then we'll just have to make sure they don't give us a reason to find out what you're capable of, she said. Thunder crashed overhead like the sound of God moving furniture, and Margaret woke to find rain hammering against her cabin windows with the fury of a Nevada storm in full rage. Lightning illuminated her bedroom in stark white flashes, and between the rumbles she could hear something else, the sound of her chickens squawking in terror from their coop. She pulled on her boots and grabbed her shawl, knowing that if the coop door had blown open, she would lose every bird to foxes or coyotes before morning. The chickens were her only reliable source of income, their eggs selling for good money at the general store in town. Margaret burst through her front door into the driving rain, immediately soaked to the skin despite her shawl. The wind hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her sideways as she fought her way toward the chicken coop behind the barn. Through the storm she could see a dark figure already there, wrestling with something in the lightning-lit chaos. Joseph was trying to herd her scattered chickens back into their shelter, his movements careful despite the urgency of the situation. "The door blew off its hinges," he shouted over the wind, pointing to where the wooden panel lay twisted in the mud. "I've got most of them, but 2 are missing." Margaret joined him in the search, crawling under bushes and behind the barn, calling for her lost birds in a voice that was swallowed by the storm. Lightning revealed the landscape in frozen moments, trees bent nearly horizontal, her vegetable garden flooded, and everywhere the silver curtain of rain falling harder than she had ever seen. They found the first chicken huddled behind the woodpile, terrified but unharmed. The second was nowhere to be seen, until another lightning flash revealed it perched impossibly high in the old oak tree, apparently having flown up there in panic. "I'll get it," Joseph called, but Margaret grabbed his arm. "Too dangerous," she shouted back. The lightning, as if to prove her point, a bolt struck somewhere close, the crack of thunder coming almost instantly. But Joseph was already moving toward the tree, his movements sure and fluid despite the treacherous conditions. Margaret watched in amazement as he climbed the oak with the skill of someone who had grown up treating trees like ladders. Even in the storm, soaked and blinded by rain, he moved with a confidence that spoke of deep familiarity with the natural world. He reached the chicken just as another lightning bolt illuminated the scene, and Margaret's heart stopped as she realized how exposed he was up there. If lightning struck the tree while he was in it, but Joseph was already climbing down, the rescued chicken tucked safely inside his shirt. He dropped the last few feet and ran with Margaret toward the barn, both of them gasping and shivering as they finally reached shelter. Inside the barn, they worked together to secure the chickens in a makeshift pen, using old boards and rope. The birds huddled together, still frightened but safe from the storm that continued to rage outside. "Thank you," Margaret said, pushing wet hair out of her eyes. "I would have lost them all without your help." Joseph was examining a scratch on his arm, where a tree branch had caught him during the climb. "Chickens are important," he said simply. "Worth the risk." Margaret looked at him more closely in the lamplight and realized the scratch was deeper than it first appeared, bleeding steadily down his forearm. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." "It's not nothing." Margaret moved closer, studying the wound with growing concern. "That needs to be cleaned and bandaged before it gets infected." They made their way through the continuing storm to her cabin, both of them dripping water on her clean floors. Margaret lit the oil lamp in her kitchen and gathered supplies: clean cloth, whiskey for disinfecting, needle and thread in case stitches were needed. "Sit," she instructed, pointing to a chair at her small table. "Let me take a look at that arm." As Margaret cleaned the wound, she became aware of how close they were sitting, how her hands looked pale against his darker skin, how steady his breathing remained, despite what must have been considerable pain. The scratch was long but not too deep, requiring careful cleaning but no stitches. "You climb trees like you grew up in them," she said, trying to distract both of them from the intimacy of the moment. "All children climb trees," Joseph replied, "but tiny children learn to climb like our lives depend on it. Sometimes they do." Margaret began wrapping the clean cloth around his arm, her fingers careful not to pull too tight. "Were you happy? As a child, I mean. Before." Joseph was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside the small kitchen felt warm and protected, a safe space where difficult truths might be spoken. "Very happy," he said finally. "My father taught me to hunt, to track, to read the sky for weather. My mother taught me the stories of our people, the songs that keep the world in balance." His voice grew softer. "I thought that life would last forever. I thought I would teach the same things to my own son." Margaret tied off the bandage and sat back, but didn't move away from the table. "What was your wife like?" A smile crossed Joseph's face, the first real smile she had seen from him. Laughing water was bright, like sunshine on the river. She could make anyone smile, even the old grandmothers who complained about everything. The smile faded. She died protecting our son when the soldiers came, threw herself between him and a rifle. Margaret felt tears threaten at the image his words created. I'm sorry. She saved him that day, but they took him anyway, said he would be better off forgetting his savage ways. Joseph's hands clenched into fists on the table. 3 years now, and I don't know if he remembers her face, remembers the song she sang to him. Margaret reached out without thinking and covered one of his fists with her hand. His skin was warm and calloused, marked by years of hard work and harder losses. Children don't forget their mothers, she said quietly. No matter what anyone tells them, no matter how much time passes, the love stays with them. Joseph looked down at her small hand covering his much larger one, and something shifted in his expression. Not the careful wariness she had grown accustomed to, but something warmer and more uncertain. You speak like someone who knows about loss, he said. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. She had been married to Edwin for 8 years, but they had rarely touched except in the mechanical way that married couples were expected to. This simple contact with Joseph felt more intimate than anything she had experienced in her marriage. Edwin and we wanted children. It just never happened. Each month I hoped, and each month. She shrugged, trying to make light of pain that still ached like an old wound. After a while, you start to wonder if God has different plans for you than the ones you made for yourself. And now? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Margaret realized that Joseph was asking about more than just her lost dreams of motherhood. He was asking about this moment, this connection that was growing between them despite every reason it shouldn't exist. Now I think maybe God's plans are stranger than anything we could imagine, she said softly. Thunder crashed overhead again, but closer to the cabin this time. The storm was moving directly over them, turning the world outside into a war zone of wind and lightning. Margaret rose to check the windows, making sure they were properly latched against the driving rain. As she moved around the small cabin, she became aware of Joseph watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was gratitude there, and something that might have been affection, but also a sadness so deep it made her chest ache. What are you thinking? She asked, turning to face him directly. Joseph was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the lamplight. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible above the storm. I am thinking that you are not what I expected when I stood on that auction block. What did you expect? Someone who would use me for labor and nothing more. Someone who would see me as property, not as a person. He paused. Someone who would not climb trees in lightning storms to save chickens that belonged to someone else. Margaret felt her breath catch at the warmth in his voice. Those chickens belong to me too now. We're partners, I suppose, in keeping this place running. Partners. Joseph repeated the word like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. Yes, I think we are. Outside, the storm began to weaken, the thunder moving farther away and the rain settling into a steady but gentler rhythm. But inside the cabin, something new was beginning, a recognition that the dollar Margaret had spent at the auction had bought something neither of them had expected. As they sat together in the warm lamplight, both of them still damp from their rescue mission, Margaret realized that for the first time since Edwin's death, she didn't feel alone. And from the way Joseph was looking at her, she suspected he might be feeling the same thing. But partnership was a dangerous word in their situation. A white widow and a Navajo man working together as equals was exactly the kind of arrangement that made people like Harold Buckley nervous. And nervous people in positions of power had a way of making life very difficult for those who challenged their expectations. Margaret looked at Joseph's bandaged arm, at the scratches he had earned saving her chickens, and realized that they had crossed another line tonight. They were no longer just a woman who had bought a man, and a man who had been bought. They were two people who had chosen to take care of each other, and that choice was going to change everything. Smoke was rising from the Morrison Ranch when Margaret spotted it from her kitchen window, a black column against the November sky that made her stomach drop like a stone thrown down a well. She had been kneading bread dough, her hands covered in flour, when the distant sound of gunshots cracked across the valley like breaking branches. "Joseph," she called, her voice sharp with alarm. "Something's wrong at the Morrisons." Joseph appeared in the doorway, his face already grim with concern. He had been mending harness leather in the barn, but the gunfire had clearly reached his ears too. In the 3 weeks since the storm, they had settled into a comfortable routine of shared work and quiet conversations. But now danger was intruding on their peaceful existence. Could be Indian raids, Joseph said carefully, though something in his expression suggested he suspected otherwise. Or it could be something else. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and moved to get a better view from the window. The Morrison Ranch lay 2 miles south, hidden behind a ridge of hills, except for the smoke now marking its location like a funeral pyre. "We should go help," she said, already reaching for her shawl. "No," Joseph's voice was firm. "Too dangerous. We don't know what's happening." But even as he spoke, they could see a rider approaching at full gallop, horse and man both lathered with sweat and foam. As the figure drew closer, Margaret recognized young Tom Morrison, Jim's 15-year-old son, bent low over his horse's neck, and riding like death itself was chasing him. Tom pulled up in their yard so hard his horse nearly sat down, its sides heaving like bellows. The boy's face was white with terror and streaked with tears, his clothes torn and dirty. "Mrs. Henley," he gasped, "you got to help us. They came at dawn, said Pa was harboring dangerous Indians, said they had authority to search everywhere." Margaret felt ice form in her veins. "Who came, Tom? Who's at your ranch?" "Buckley, and maybe 20 men, some I never seen before. They got Pa tied up. Said they found evidence he was hiding runaway Indians. Ma's crying and the little ones are screaming and they're burning everything." Tom's words tumbled over each other in his panic. Joseph stepped forward, his face carved from stone. "What kind of evidence?" Tom looked at Joseph with desperate eyes. "Blankets. Indian blankets, they said, proved Pa was helping fugitives. But Pa bought those blankets fair and square from a trader last month. I was with him." Margaret's mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. Jim Morrison was no friend to Indians. He had bid against her at the auction where she bought Joseph. But he was also a decent man who wouldn't harbor fugitives or break territorial law. "They planted evidence," she said, the realization hitting her like cold water. "Buckley planted those blankets to give himself an excuse to take the Morrison Ranch." Joseph nodded grimly. "Same thing they tried here with the false warrant. But this time they came prepared with proof." Tom's horse was still breathing hard, foam dripping from its bit. "They said they're coming here next. Said this whole valley needs to be cleaned out of Indian sympathizers. Pa told me to warn you, said you should run while you still can." Margaret looked at Joseph, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his dark eyes. If they ran now, they would be admitting guilt. But if they stayed, they would be facing 20 armed men, with nothing but their own courage and whatever weapons they could find. "How long do we have?" Joseph asked. Tom glanced back toward the smoke rising from his family's ranch. "Maybe an hour, maybe less. They were still searching when I left, but they'll be done soon." Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. "Tom, take your horse to the well and let it drink. Then ride to town as fast as you can and find Marshal Carson. Tell him what's happening." "Marshal Carson ain't in town," Tom said, shaking his head. "He rode north 3 days ago, won't be back for a week." The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. Carson was the only lawman in the territory who might stand up to Buckley, the only one who cared more about justice than profit. "Then ride to the telegraph office," she said. "Send word to the territorial capital. Tell them armed men are attacking ranches under false pretenses." Joseph touched her arm gently. "Margaret, we need to face reality. 20 men with guns against 2 people with." He looked around their small farm. "What do we have? One old hunting rifle and good intentions?" Margaret felt something fierce and stubborn rise up in her chest, the same feeling that had made her bid $1 for a man at auction. "We have the truth, and we have each other." Tom looked between them with wide eyes. "You ain't really gonna fight them, are you? Mrs. Henley, these ain't regular folks upset about something. These are hard men, killers, some of them." "Then you better ride for help right now," Margaret said firmly. "Go, Tom, fast as you can." The boy hesitated for one more second, then nodded and ran for his horse. Within moments he was galloping north toward town, leaving Margaret and Joseph alone with the sound of wind and the distant smell of smoke. Joseph walked to the barn and returned with Edwin's old rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. "This won't stop 20 men." "No," Margaret agreed, "but maybe we don't need to stop them. Maybe we just need to make them think twice about what they're doing." She moved through the cabin quickly, gathering the few valuable things she owned, her mother's silver hairbrush, Edwin's pocket watch, the deed to the farm. If they survived this, she wanted proof of what belonged to her. As she worked, Joseph watched her with an expression that mixed admiration and concern. "You know what this means," he said quietly. "If we fight Buckley and lose, it won't just be the ranch you lose. It'll be everything." Margaret paused in her packing and looked at him directly. "And if we don't fight, we lose everything anyway. At least this way we go down swinging." Joseph was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "In my tribe, we have a saying. A warrior's death is better than a coward's life." "Good thing I'm not planning on dying today," Margaret replied with more confidence than she felt. They could hear the sound of approaching horses now, still distant but growing closer. Margaret counted the sounds definitely more than a few riders, probably the full group Tom had described. Joseph positioned himself by the front window where he could see the approach to the cabin. Margaret took the back window, Edwin's rifle heavy in her hands. She had never shot at another human being, had barely used the gun for hunting, but desperation was a powerful teacher. "Margaret," Joseph said softly, not taking his eyes off the path. "Whatever happens, I want you to know these past weeks have been the happiest I've known since my family was taken." Margaret felt tears threaten at the sincerity in his voice. "Joseph, don't talk like we're saying goodbye. We're going to get through this." "Maybe," he said. "But if we don't, I needed you to know." The sound of horses was getting closer now, accompanied by voices and the jingle of spurs. Margaret could make out individual words carried on, the wind orders being given, plans being discussed, the casual confidence of men who expected easy victory. "Here they come," Joseph said, his voice steady as stone. Margaret watched through her window as riders began surrounding their small cabin, spreading out to cut off any escape routes. She counted 15 men, not the 20 Tom had mentioned, but still more than enough to overwhelm 2 people with 1 rifle. Harold Buckley rode up to the front of the cabin, sitting tall in his saddle like a general surveying conquered territory. Behind him rode the same unnamed gunman from their previous encounter, along with a dozen others Margaret didn't recognize. "Margaret!" Buckley called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Come on out! We need to have ourselves a talk." Margaret looked at Joseph, who shook his head slightly. Whatever Buckley wanted to discuss, it wouldn't end well for either of them. "I can hear you fine from in here, Harold," Margaret called back. "Say what you came to say." Buckley's laughter was sharp and unpleasant. "Found some interesting things at the Morrison place. Evidence that this whole valley's been harboring dangerous fugitives. Figured we better check all the ranches, make sure there ain't no more surprises." "What kind of evidence?" Margaret demanded, though she already knew the answer. "Indian artifacts, weapons, things that suggest folks been helping enemies of the territory." Buckley's voice grew harder. "Now, you can make this easy or hard, Margaret. Send out that Indian you bought, and we'll search your place peaceful-like. Resist, and we'll do what needs doing anyway." Joseph moved closer to Margaret's position, speaking quietly. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen. If things go bad, you hide there. I'm not hiding while you face them alone." "Margaret, no." Her voice was firm. "We're partners, remember? Partners don't abandon each other." Outside, Buckley was growing impatient. "I'm giving you 1 minute to decide, Margaret. After that, we come in and take what we want." Margaret looked around her small cabin at the kitchen table, where she and Joseph had shared quiet meals, at the fireplace where they had sat talking on cold evenings, at the windows that looked out on land she had fought to keep. This was her home, bought with Edwin's sweat and blood, defended with her own determination. She wasn't giving it up without a fight. "Harold Buckley," she called out, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. "You're trespassing on private property. Leave now, or face the consequences." The silence that followed her words was broken only by the sound of men checking their weapons and horses shifting nervously in the cold air. Margaret realized that she had just declared war on one of the most powerful men in the territory, with nothing but courage and 1 old rifle to back up her defiance. But as she looked at Joseph, saw the pride and determination in his dark eyes, she knew she had made the right choice. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. Some partnerships were worth defending, even when the world insisted they shouldn't exist. The sound of spurs approaching the cabin door told her the talking was over. Now they would discover what they were really made of. The first shot shattered Margaret's front window like an explosion of crystal, sending glass fragments across her kitchen floor in a shower that caught the morning light like deadly rain. She ducked behind the thick log wall, her heart hammering so hard she could barely hear Joseph's voice calling her name from across the room. "Stay down!" he shouted, but his words were nearly drowned out by the thunder of hoofbeats as Buckley's men began circling the cabin like wolves around wounded prey. Margaret had never been in a gunfight, had never imagined the overwhelming chaos of it. The smell of gunpowder, the splintering of wood as bullets punched through her walls, the shouts of men outside coordinating their attack. Edwin's rifle felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hands. "The back door," Joseph called out, pointing toward the kitchen. "They're trying to get behind us." Margaret crawled across the floor, staying below the windows as more shots rang out. Through the chaos, she could hear Buckley's voice shouting orders. "Burn them out if you have to. I want that Indian alive, but the woman's expendable." The casual way he dismissed her life, like she was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed, filled Margaret with a rage so pure it burned away her fear. She reached the back window and peered carefully around the frame, spotting two men approaching the rear of the cabin with torches in their hands. Margaret had never shot at another human being, but as she watched them prepare to set fire to the home she had fought so hard to keep, something deadly calm settled over her. She raised Edwin's rifle, sighted carefully on the nearest man, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder like an angry mule, and through the smoke she saw the man with the torch stumble backward, clutching his arm. The torch fell into the dirt, its flame sputtering out in the mud. "She got Jake," someone yelled. "The widow's got teeth." More gunfire erupted from the front of the cabin as Joseph returned fire through the broken window. Margaret reloaded Edwin's rifle with hands that were steadier than she had any right to expect, her movements automatic despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. The second man with a torch was more cautious now, using the barn for cover as he approached. Margaret waited, controlling her breathing the way Edwin had taught her when they went hunting for deer. "Patience," he had always said. "Wait for the right shot." When the man broke cover, running toward the cabin with his torch held high, Margaret was ready. This time, her shot took him in the leg, sending him sprawling face first into the dirt. The torch rolled away from the cabin, its threat neutralized. "Nice shooting," Joseph called out, genuine admiration in his voice despite their desperate situation. But their small victory was short-lived. Through the gaps in the walls, Margaret could see Buckley's men regrouping, preparing for a coordinated assault that would overwhelm their defenses through sheer numbers. "They're getting ready to rush us," Joseph said, his voice grim. "When they come, they'll come from all sides at once." Margaret checked her ammunition. 3 bullets left, plus whatever Joseph had for his borrowed pistol. Not nearly enough to stop a dozen determined men. That's when she heard something unexpected, the sound of approaching horses from the north, moving fast and accompanied by voices she didn't recognize. Buckley's men heard it too. Their attack hesitated as they tried to identify the new arrivals. "Hold your fire," a powerful voice boomed across the valley. "This is Deputy Marshal Williams. Lower your weapons." Margaret felt hope bloom in her chest like a flower after rain. Tom Morrison had found help after all, had somehow located a federal lawman who was willing to intervene. Through the broken window, she could see a man in a marshal's uniform riding into the yard, followed by 6 well-armed deputies. Deputy Marshal Williams was a big man with gray hair and the kind of presence that made people pay attention when he spoke. "Harold Buckley," Williams called out. "I'm ordering you and your men to stand down immediately." Buckley rode forward to meet the marshal, his face dark with fury at this unexpected interference. "This is territorial business, Williams. Federal law doesn't apply here." "Federal law applies everywhere, Buckley, especially when it comes to armed groups attacking private property." Williams gestured toward the cabin. "Mrs. Henley, are you and your companion injured?" Margaret stood carefully, staying ready to duck if shooting resumed. "We're alive, Marshal, but they've been trying to burn us out." Williams turned back to Buckley, his expression hard as granite. "Is that true? Were you planning to burn down a woman's home?" "We were trying to apprehend a dangerous fugitive," Buckley replied, but some of the confidence had gone out of his voice. "We have evidence that Mrs. Henley has been harboring escaped Indians." "What evidence?" Buckley gestured to one of his men, who rode forward carrying a leather saddlebag. Indian artifacts found on neighboring properties, proof of a conspiracy to aid enemies of the territory. Williams took the bag and examined its contents, blankets, jewelry, and other items that looked authentically Native American. But as he studied them more closely, his expression grew skeptical. "These items are brand new," he said finally. "Never been used, never been worn. They look like the kind of things you'd buy from a trader, not personal belongings of fugitives." Margaret watched Buckley's face change as he realized his planted evidence wasn't convincing the marshal. The confident predator was being challenged by someone with real authority, and he didn't like it. "Even so," Buckley said, "harboring Indians is against territorial law. Mrs. Henley bought that man at a legal auction. She owns him, which makes her responsible for his actions." Williams dismounted and walked toward the cabin, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Mrs. Henley, may I speak with you and your employee?" Margaret emerged from the cabin, Joseph beside her, both of them keeping their hands visible and non-threatening. Up close, Deputy Marshal Williams looked like a man who had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, but who still believed in doing the right thing. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim respectfully, "I'm investigating reports of illegal activities in this valley. Can you tell me about your arrangement with this gentleman?" "Joseph works my farm in exchange for food and shelter," Margaret said clearly. "He's free to leave any time he wants. I don't consider him property." Williams looked at Joseph directly. "Is that accurate? Are you free to go if you choose?" Joseph met the marshal's eyes without flinching. "Yes, I stay because I choose to stay." "And have you committed any crimes in this territory? Stolen anything? Hurt anyone?" "No," Joseph said simply. "I work the land. I harm no one." Williams nodded and turned back to Buckley. "I don't see any evidence of criminal activity here. I do see evidence of harassment and attempted arson." His voice grew harder. "Unless you have a warrant signed by a territorial judge, I'm ordering you to disperse immediately." Buckley's face went red with rage. "You're making a mistake, Williams. These people are dangerous, and this whole valley needs to be cleaned out before—" "Before what?" Williams interrupted. "Before people start thinking they can live peacefully regardless of their race. Before they start believing in the law instead of the gun." The marshal's words hung in the air like a challenge, and Margaret realized she was witnessing something significant, a moment when justice and prejudice faced each other directly, with real consequences hanging in the balance. Buckley looked around at his men, calculating his options. He still outnumbered the federal officers, but attacking a deputy marshal would bring the full weight of the territorial government down on him. Even his wealth and influence couldn't protect him from that kind of trouble. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice low and threatening. "Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," Williams replied calmly. "At least the illegal part. If you have legitimate complaints about Mrs. Henley or her employee, file them through proper channels. But if I hear about any more armed groups riding around this valley, I'll be back with a lot more deputies." As Buckley and his men rode away, their defeat evident in their slumped shoulders and angry muttering, Margaret felt her legs go weak with relief. The immediate danger was over, but she knew Buckley's threat wasn't empty. He would find other ways to cause trouble, more subtle methods of making their lives difficult. Williams approached them again, his expression kindly but serious. "Mrs. Henley, I want you to know that what you did today took considerable courage. Standing up to armed men isn't something most folks would attempt." "I was protecting my home," Margaret said simply. "And my friend." The marshal glanced at Joseph, who had remained silent during the confrontation. "You're a fortunate man to have such a loyal employer." "She is not my employer," Joseph said quietly. "She is my partner in all things." The simple declaration sent a shock through Margaret that had nothing to do with the violence they had just survived. Joseph had called her his partner in front of a federal officer, claiming a relationship that went beyond the legal fiction of their original arrangement. Williams raised an eyebrow, but said nothing about the implications of Joseph's words. Instead, he handed Margaret a card with his name and address. "If Buckley or his men bother you again, send word immediately. The territorial government is trying to establish real law out here, not the kind that depends on who has the most guns." As the marshal and his deputies rode away, Margaret and Joseph stood together in the yard of their battle-scarred cabin, surrounded by broken glass and bullet holes, but still standing, still together. "Partner," Margaret said softly, testing the word on her tongue. Joseph looked at her with eyes that held warmth and something deeper: respect, affection, and perhaps the beginning of love. In all things, he confirmed. Margaret realized that Harold Buckley had inadvertently given them a gift. In trying to destroy their partnership, he had forced them to defend it publicly, to declare their commitment to each other in front of witnesses who mattered. They were no longer a widow who had bought a man for $1. They were two people who had chosen to stand together against the world, and that choice had made them stronger than either could have been alone. A child's laughter drifted across the valley on the December wind, pure and joyful as spring water, but it made Joseph freeze in the middle of chopping firewood like he'd been struck by lightning. Margaret looked up from where she was hanging laundry on the line, her hands still clutching one of Joseph's mended shirts, and saw tears streaming down his weathered face. "That sound," he whispered, his voice breaking like thin ice. "I know that laugh." Through the crisp morning air, they could see a small figure running through the brown grass toward their cabin, followed by a man on horseback, riding at a careful distance. The child moved with the boundless energy of youth, but there was something familiar in the way he held his head, the rhythm of his steps. Joseph dropped his axe and began walking toward the approaching figures, his movements uncertain, as if he was afraid this might be a dream that would shatter if he moved too quickly. Margaret followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear for what this moment might bring. As the child drew closer, Margaret could see his features more clearly: dark hair that caught the sunlight, eyes that were unmistakably Joseph's, and a face that carried the stamp of both his parents despite years of institutional life. "Papa?" the boy called out, his voice thin with disbelief and desperate hope. "Papa, is it really you?" Joseph fell to his knees in the dirt, his arms opening wide, and the child, Thomas, Little Wolf, whatever name he had been forced to carry, ran into his father's embrace with a sob that seemed to contain 3 years of loneliness and longing. Margaret stood back, tears flowing freely down her cheeks as she watched father and son hold each other with a desperation that spoke of dreams deferred and prayers finally answered. The rider approached more slowly, and she recognized Deputy Marshal Williams, his weathered face soft with something that might have been satisfaction. "How?" Joseph managed to ask, his voice muffled against his son's hair. "How did you find him?" Williams dismounted and approached carefully, clearly understanding the sacred nature of this reunion. "Mrs. Chen in town mentioned your situation to my wife when she was doing laundry. My wife mentioned it to her sister, who works for the Territorial Education Department. Sometimes the best investigations happen through gossip." The boy Thomas pulled back from his father's embrace just enough to study Joseph's face with eyes that were wise beyond their 10 years. "They told me you were dead," he said simply. "They said Mama was dead too, and I was an orphan who needed to forget his savage ways." Joseph's face contorted with pain at his son's words. "Your mother is dead, Little Wolf, but I am alive, and I have never stopped looking for you." "Little Wolf?" Thomas repeated the name like he was tasting something he had almost forgotten. "They called me Timothy at the school. Timothy Johnson. They said my real name was the devil's language." Margaret felt anger surge through her at the casual cruelty of people who thought they could erase a child's identity like chalk from a slate, but she pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the miracle unfolding in front of her. William stepped closer, his expression serious. "I need to explain the legal situation," he said carefully. "The mission school's custody was based on forged documents, claiming both parents were deceased. When we proved Joseph was alive and searching for his son, their legal claim dissolved." Joseph looked up at the marshal, still holding Thomas close. "He's free? He can stay with me?" "He's free," Williams confirmed, "though the transition might be difficult. 3 years in institutional care changes a child. He's been taught to think of his heritage as shameful, his language as forbidden." Thomas looked between his father and the marshal, confusion clear in his young face. "Am I in trouble? The teacher said if I ever tried to find my family, I would be punished." Joseph's arms tightened around his son. "You are not in trouble, Little Wolf. You are home." Margaret realized she had been holding her breath through this entire exchange. The boy was beautiful, clearly Joseph's child, but she could see the institutional stiffness in his posture, the way he kept glancing around as if expecting punishment for some unnamed transgression. "Thomas," she said gently, approaching slowly like she might approach a skittish animal. "I'm Margaret. I'm your father's partner. The boy studied her with solemn eyes. Are you his wife? The direct question caught Margaret off guard. She and Joseph had never discussed marriage, had barely acknowledged the feelings growing between them. But Thomas was looking at her with the frank curiosity of childhood, waiting for an answer that would help him understand his place in this new world. I'm his friend, Margaret said carefully. We work together, take care of each other, we take care of this farm together. Thomas nodded as if this made perfect sense. At the school, they said Indians couldn't be friends with white people. They said it was against God's plan. Joseph's jaw tightened at his son's words. They said many things that were not true, little wolf. People of different colors can be friends, can care for each other, can build good lives together. Williams cleared his throat gently. I need to be heading back to town, but I wanted to make sure the reunion went smoothly. He looked at Margaret and Joseph seriously. This will likely attract attention. People who supported the mission schools won't be happy about this precedent. Margaret felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Just when it seemed like they might find peace, new challenges appeared on the horizon. What kind of attention? She asked. Political attention. The territorial government is debating new policies about Indian children and education. Thomas's case could become a symbol for either side of that debate. William's expression grew grave. Symbols have a way of attracting trouble. Joseph stood, keeping one arm around Thomas's shoulders. We will face whatever comes. We have faced worse. After Williams rode away, the three of them stood together in the yard, an unlikely family bound by choice rather than blood. Margaret realized she felt nervous in a way she hadn't expected, not about external threats, but about whether she belonged in this reunion, whether there was room for her in the relationship between father and son. Are you hungry? She asked Thomas, falling back on the universal motherly instinct to feed anyone who looked like they needed care. The boy's eyes lit up with an eagerness that spoke of institutional meals that never quite satisfied. Yes, ma'am. Very hungry. As they walked toward the cabin, Thomas peppered his father with questions in a mixture of English and halting Navajo, his native language clearly rusty from disuse. Margaret listened to Joseph patiently answer each question, explaining where they were, how long he had been searching, what their life was like now. Inside the cabin, Margaret busied herself preparing a meal while father and son sat at the kitchen table, simply looking at each other, as if trying to memorize every detail. She found herself studying Thomas surreptitiously, noting the way he held himself with careful precision, the way he waited for permission before touching anything. Little wolf, Joseph said gently, this is your home now. You don't need to ask permission to sit, to eat, to speak. You are safe here. Thomas nodded, but Margaret could see it would take time for him to truly believe that safety. 3 years of rigid institutional life had taught him to be cautious, to expect punishment for stepping out of line. As she served the meal venison stew, fresh bread, milk from their cow, Margaret watched Thomas eat with the focused intensity of someone who had learned not to waste food. But gradually, as his hunger was satisfied and the warmth of the cabin settled around him, she saw him begin to relax. Papa, he said suddenly, do you still know the story about Coyote and the stars? Joseph's face lit up with joy. I know all the stories, little wolf, and I will teach them to you again, if you want to remember. I want to remember everything, Thomas said fiercely, everything they tried to make me forget. Margaret felt her heart clench at the determination in the child's voice. He was so young to carry such anger, such resolve, but she also recognized something familiar in his expression, the same stubborn strength she had seen in Joseph's face, the same refusal to be broken that had drawn her to his father. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself included in their conversations in ways that felt natural and right. Thomas asked her about the farm, about the animals, about how she and his father had met. When she told the story of the auction, his eyes grew wide with amazement. You bought Papa for $1? He asked incredulously. Best dollar I ever spent, Margaret replied, earning a smile from Joseph that warmed her all the way through. But as evening approached, new challenges began to surface. Thomas grew agitated when darkness fell, flinching at every sound outside the cabin. When Margaret suggested he might want to sleep in the loft, he shook his head violently. Can I sleep in the barn with Papa? He asked, his voice small. I don't like being alone in the dark. Joseph's expression grew pained as he realized what institutional life had done to his son's sense of security. Of course, little wolf. We will sleep together until you feel safe. As they settled in for the night, Margaret lay in her own bed listening to the quiet murmur of voices from the barn father and son talking softly in Navajo, rebuilding connections that had been severed but not destroyed. She realized that her life had just become infinitely more complicated, but also infinitely richer. Thomas's presence would change everything. They were no longer just two adults choosing to build a life together. They were now responsible for a traumatized child who needed healing, protection, and the chance to reclaim his stolen heritage. But as Margaret drifted off to sleep, she found herself smiling. For the first time since Edwin's death, her cabin felt truly alive, filled with the sounds and energy of family, chosen rather than given, but real nonetheless. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats from people who disapproved of their unconventional arrangement. But tonight, a father and son were together again, and Margaret Henley was no longer a lonely widow struggling to survive. She was part of something larger, something worth fighting for, something that had begun with a dollar bid and grown into love. Spring sunshine streamed through the new glass windows of Margaret's cabin as she watched Joseph teach Thomas to plant corn in the traditional way, their hands dark against the rich soil that had been turned and prepared with winter's patient work. 6 months had passed since Thomas's return, and the boy had grown taller, stronger, more confident in ways that showed healing could happen even after deep wounds. The corn must have sisters, Joseph was explaining, his voice carrying the rhythm of old teachings. Beans to climb the stalks, squash to shade the ground. They help each other grow, just like families do. Thomas nodded solemnly, then grinned. Like you and Margaret help each other? Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks at the boy's direct question. In the months since Thomas's arrival, she and Joseph had grown closer in ways that were both obvious and unspoken. They shared the work of raising Thomas, made decisions together about the farm, sat together in the evenings while the boy practiced his Navajo or carved small animals from wood scraps. But they had never named what was growing between them, never discussed the future beyond the immediate needs of each day. Perhaps because naming it would make it real, and real things could be taken away. Yes, Joseph said simply, meeting Margaret's eyes across the garden. Like families help each other. A rider approaching from town interrupted the peaceful morning, and Margaret felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Visitors still meant potential trouble, even though Deputy Marshal Williams had kept his word about protecting them from Harold Buckley's harassment. But this rider was young Tom Morrison, now grown into a man at 16, his face serious but not frightened, as it had been during the attack on his family's ranch. "Mrs. Henley," he called out, dismounting with the easy grace of someone raised on horseback. "Got news from town you need to hear." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, Joseph and Thomas following. Tom's expression was hard to read, not angry or scared, but carrying the weight of information that would change things. "What is it, Tom?" "Buckley's dead," Tom said simply. "Shot in a card game last night at the Silver Dollar Saloon." The words hit Margaret like cold water, unexpected and disorienting. Harold Buckley had been the shadow hanging over their lives for months, the threat that never quite materialized but never quite disappeared. Now he was simply gone. "Who shot him?" Joseph asked quietly. "Traveling gambler named Pierce. Seems Buckley accused him of cheating, went for his gun, and Pierce was faster." Tom shrugged. "Sheriff says it was self-defense. Witnesses back up Pierce's story." Margaret found herself struggling to feel any emotion about Buckley's death beyond relief. The man had tried to burn her out of her home, had threatened her family, had made her life a constant state of watchful tension. His death meant safety in ways she was only beginning to understand. "There's more," Tom continued. "Buckley's nephew from back east is coming to settle the estate. Word is he's planning to sell off all the ranch land, divide it up into smaller parcels for homesteaders." This news carried different implications. Buckley's massive ranch had dominated the valley's economy and politics. With it broken up, the balance of power would shift dramatically. "What does that mean for us?" Margaret asked. Tom smiled for the first time since arriving. "Means you folks are going to have neighbors who aren't beholden to Harold Buckley. Means families looking to start fresh, work their own land, mind their own business." Joseph nodded slowly, and Margaret could see him processing the implications. More people meant more witnesses to their way of life, more potential allies, but also more potential problems from those who disapproved of their arrangements. "There's something else," Tom said, his expression growing more serious. "Territorial governor's planning a visit next month, coming to see how the new homestead policies are working out. Word is he's particularly interested in unusual situations." Margaret felt her heart sink. Political attention was exactly what Deputy Marshal Williams had warned them about. Thomas's case had apparently become the symbol Williams had predicted, drawing scrutiny from the highest levels of territorial government. "What kind of interest?" Joseph asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Both kinds," Tom replied honestly. "Some folks think what you've done here proves that different people can live together peacefully. Others think it's an example of what happens when proper social order breaks down." Thomas, who had been listening quietly, stepped closer to his father. "Are they going to take me away again?" Joseph's arm went around his son's shoulders immediately. "No one is taking you anywhere, little wolf. You belong here with us." Margaret felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her at the worry in Thomas's voice. This boy had already been stolen from his family once. She wouldn't let it happen again. "Tom," she said firmly, "what exactly does the governor want to see? How you live, how the boy's being educated, whether you're following territorial laws about Indian children." Tom's expression grew sympathetic. "Mrs. Henley, I'm not saying it's fair. I'm just saying you better be ready to prove that what you're doing here is right and legal." After Tom left, the three of them stood in their garden, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life. The neat rows of planted seeds, the repaired barn, the chicken coop that had been rebuilt after the storm. Everything they had built together, everything they had fought to protect. "We need to make plans," Margaret said finally. "If the governor is coming to judge us, we need to be ready." Joseph nodded. "What kind of plans?" Margaret looked at Thomas, at the boy who had grown so much in confidence and happiness since returning to his father. She thought about the unconventional family they had become, the way their lives had woven together into something stronger than any of them could have been alone. "We need to show him that love doesn't follow the rules people try to make for it," she said. "That families can be built through choice as well as blood. That a white widow, a Navajo man, and a lost boy can create something beautiful together." Thomas looked up at her with eyes that held wisdom beyond his years. "Are you going to marry Papa?" The question hung in the spring air like a challenge. Margaret looked at Joseph, seeing her own feelings reflected in his dark eyes: love, commitment, and the courage to claim what they had built together. "Would you like that?" she asked Thomas gently. The boy's face lit up with joy. "Yes, then we'd be a real family." "We're already a real family," Joseph said quietly. "But if Margaret is willing." Margaret felt tears threaten as she realized this was the moment she had been afraid to hope for. Not just marriage, but the recognition of what they had already become: partners in every sense, bound together by choice and strengthened by the challenges they had faced. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm willing." Joseph stepped forward and took her hands in his calloused fingers that had learned to be gentle, that had taught his son to plant corn and carved birds in flight from memory. "Margaret Henley," he said formally, "will you be my wife? Will you be mother to my son? Will you stand with us against whatever comes?" "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice strong and clear. "To all of it. Yes." Thomas whooped with joy and threw his arms around both of them, pulling them into an embrace that felt like the seal on a promise. As they held each other in the spring sunshine, Margaret realized that her story had come full circle, from the desperate woman who bid $1 for hope to the woman who had found everything she never dared to dream of. They would face the governor's visit together. They would prove that their family, chosen and claimed, was as real and valid as any other. They would show the world that love was stronger than prejudice, that courage could triumph over convention. Margaret looked out over their land, their home, their future, and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as they had met everything else together, with the strength that came from choosing each other daily, choosing love over fear, choosing hope over the easy path of surrender. The $1 she had spent at that auction had bought her more than a man's labor. It had bought her a future she never could have imagined, a family she never could have planned, and a love that proved the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in money. As they walked back toward their cabin, Toward the dinner that waited and the evening that would be spent planning their wedding and preparing for whatever political storms might come, Margaret Henley smiled with the confidence of a woman who had learned the difference between what she could afford and what she was worth. And she was worth everything.